This is episode 188 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, it's snowing here.
It's snow.
Mid-April.
Yep. Reminds me of golf season in high school. Nothing more fun than playing golf in the snow in Silver City back in the 70s. So
nice. Well, we'll talk a little bit about golf later on in this podcast, among other things. I did a little social distancing outdoors this weekend. The increasingly few number of places that you can do such things. I climbed the Pinot Trail, which goes from the Open Space Center up to the ridge line of the Sandias. And it was a nice hike, stuff I don't do as much when I have kids to take to different activities and my own stuff going on. It's a good hike, 4.5 miles approximately, pretty uphill.
yeah, and it's a pretty hike. I've done that hike a few times. What I like about it is reminds me of the old westerns. There's some canyons like that around Hollywood where they'd go. You always expect the bad guys to be behind those big rocks that you're weaving through, particularly in the lower country.
Yeah, and of course by now there's probably several inches of snow up at the end of the Pinot Trail and the Sandia Crest, and who knows? At least theoretically, some snow on the mountains always gives some social distancing opportunities, and that's kind of where we are as a society and as a state, Wally. But the first thing I want to talk about is some of the decisions that our governor has made, and that I think she should consider reversing. Now, this is tough because we've generally had a wide berth at this point for the governor in terms of her decisions in dealing with this crisis. I'm more of an open government, open business kind of guy, as I suspect you are. She's been relatively moderate in her approach, although she's been clamping down in recent weeks. And I think that's where some of these real concerns arise from, is that she started out taking a little bit more nuanced approach, and now she's been much more aggressive. And this was, of course, Easter weekend here, and one of the decisions that generated quite a bit of consternation is with the churches, limiting churches to having no more than 5 people in them. And, I think what we're missing here with some of these policies, and we'll go through the entire list, but Happy Easter, of course, Wally. It was
Happy Easter to you.
Easter that I don't think any of us will soon forget. First time I haven't been to church probably in my entire 44 years now of life. I grew up very Catholic, and even when I one Easter was living in Argentina, I made my way to church in Argentina, and I suspect it's probably, even when I was a tiny baby, I was going. But 5 people in a church. Now, I think if the governor truly had an innovative mindset that, they do that church service at the UNM football stadium.
Yeah.
She could have opened up the football and even the baseball stadiums, working with the mayor, of course, that, in the university, owning those facilities, and had a social distancing church service just all day, for all 16 hours or so that the sun was up, that they could have had people try to do church services in a socially distant fashion, try to be equitable among the different faiths, et cetera. And it could have been a really great come together moment. Instead, we get a lawsuit against the state, against the governor, filed by, I believe, Legacy Church. And really this kind of back and forth about whether you should be able to attend church on Easter, and the governor's message, and clamping down, and really taking I think a hard line unnecessarily against churches. And we won't spend all this amount of time on everything, but I think that that's one that a lot of people are very concerned about.
Yeah, they are, and you have church and state, and I won't say separation because that's a misnomer if you read the Constitution. But yeah, freedom of religion in our country is definitely something that's very strong, and I do think that there were people that felt like maybe that was being infringed upon. And even if you disagree that that was the right thing to do, I'm with you. It just seemed that the tone on that one did not seem like it was very politically astute. I mean, you could have come across way different, and it came across pretty shrill to me. And as we talk further in this podcast, and as our country talks about the reopening of America and what does that mean and the reopening of New Mexico, there are a lot of tough decisions to be made, no doubt about it. And they're being made with imperfect information. Guess what, though? All decisions like that are made with imperfect information. This one, there's just a lot more at stake. And so we will see. People are getting restless out there, though. Every age group, I'm sensing a restlessness where I don't think people, if you were to say tomorrow, you could go do whatever you want, I don't think the restaurants would be packed. I don't think the shopping malls would be packed, but there is a restlessness out there. And it's not just economic, it's just practical, much less if you've lost your job and you can't go to work. You know, I could imagine I've been fortunate enough that I've been able to do my job and it has not gone away. And, you know, I've had some clients that are no longer doing work, and so I won't be billing them, but I have enough that's keeping me busy, keeping me going. I feel for those people who are basically there saying, your job's gone, you've been laid off, you work in an industry where we don't know if you'll ever be allowed to come back, and have fun on unemployment. So, you know, there is a lot there. And then if you look at it from the state's point of view, just what's happening to the gross state product of New Mexico, the gross domestic product of the United States, and then all the taxes and all the fiscal ramifications, it's very serious.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that are being done allegedly to address this crisis that don't seem to have much impact or justification. One, and it's been written up in the Albuquerque Journal, medical facilities and elective and outpatient medical procedures. You know, you're dealing with hospitals seeing declines of 40 to 60% in their revenues. The people who pay the freight, you know, hospitals are a very unusual economic model because they have so many people who pay a fraction, and by pay, I mean the government typically pays for them. Medicaid in particular, which is a huge presence in this state, Medicare in another context as well. But the people who actually keep the lights on at hospitals pay with their insurance companies and sometimes cash or some form of direct payment. But we have no elective procedures going on. You can't get your teeth cleaned in the state of New Mexico right now. We have somebody who deals with eye issues on our board of directors, and she has to shut down her practice. So we're not just talking about people going to the hospital and having knee replacement or something like that, although that's an issue, and there's a lot of people who are going without so-called elective health care, and you're seeing doctors and nurses and folks being furloughed, I think very unnecessarily, from places around the state that would otherwise be providing needed health care. Now, I'm not saying that every elected procedure should be done, but I think rather than taking this decision from the state, central planning, you should have the hospitals and medical providers given a little bit more discretion. Do they have enough tools, masks, etc., in order to carry out these operations or not? It's not really a decision best made by the state government.
Yeah, and then I've been following just my hometown. The Gila Regional Medical Center is one of many rural hospitals that's really on the brink of bankruptcy. And you don't make money holding your emergency room open for hypothetical COVID-19 patients to come in if the rest of your operation is shut down. And that's just an example in the quasi public sector of the damage that's being done. Talk to people economically about what's being done on the business sector, and it is very disturbing. And now's as good as time as any for my metaphor is when they teach you to fly, and this is all secondhand, but I've heard it from pilots, is they say when you have a problem is fly the plane. So there's a story about a warning light goes on in a flight over Florida, and when the pilot and co-pilot are worrying about this light, which is not in a key system, they run the plane into the Everglades and kill themselves and all on board. And so that's just one of the many examples. And so for the last few months, the plane has been reduction of COVID-19, reduction of coronavirus infections. That's been the only focus. And maybe at the time it was appropriate, and maybe it still is, maybe it still isn't. But taken to its illogical conclusion, if no one ever goes anywhere again, we probably can reduce COVID-19 infection, probably without a doubt. But we have this thing that's called the economy. And as huge swaths of the economy are just put into ruin, and who knows if and when many of them, if any of them will come back, it's getting to be where maybe the plane is this thing that's called our economy, that the economy is what we do to grow our food, provide energy, provide housing, food, shelter, and clothing, if it were. And I think there's time for nuance. Now, I did see where some Eastern governors are looking at reopening the economy. I think New Mexico ought to be part of a group of Western governors, or our Western governor looks at open the economy. And again, it's not going to go back to how it was. We're not going to pre-COVID anytime soon. Mm-hmm. But to keep our economy where it is, and particularly with the other 800-pound gorilla in New Mexico that hasn't been talked of, is the virtual annihilation in the short term of the oil and gas industry. An economy is an important thing. And health is an important thing, but what is the eventual goal is to have an economy and a society that works, where people are well and actually have the ability to sustain themselves, food, shelter, and clothing. And I'm starting to get some pangs of concern that that economy is not going to be there in a way that will recover in anything close to a reasonable time, if ever.
Yeah, and talking a little bit less about some completely core services like medical, but recreational as well. People are getting stir crazy, and that's only going to worsen as this lockdown continues. We have 35 state parks that have been shut down right now. About half of those are lakes or some kind of large body of water. And I'm not saying that that's the only way that you can get out and socially distance, but camping, getting out on a boat, going fishing, there's got to be innovative approaches that can be taken by the state of New Mexico to keep a significant portion of those facilities open. It's not a revenue situation. It might be a vitamin D situation, the sunlight that does benefit individuals, keeps them healthy, mental sanity, getting out and doing things. There's got to be a middle ground here with regard to the state parks. Golf courses is another one. You're a golfer, I'm a golfer. This isn't about self-interest, though. This is about rational policy. You can get out on a golf course, and the only time that you're really potentially, if you're careful, in a non-socially distanced situation is if you're riding on a golf cart with somebody else. Probably you should eliminate that, but you can have singles riding. You can mandate everybody walk, whatever it might be. And again, these are jobs and mental health, personal, physical health opportunities that we're eliminating, closing off from people. Nurseries, and I don't mean the kind that have babies, I mean the kind that have plants and flowers, and it's springtime. Those are closed as well. You're not able to go, at least to a majority. Some of them have figured out some loopholes, and Lowe's, a big box, has the ability, and this is one of the complaints I've heard from a lot of people, is that a lot of the restrictions have been written maybe not for the benefit, but to the benefit of the big box stores, whereas an actual nursery where you buy seedlings and plants and soil and all the various things, those are unable to be opened. And, it's one of those things that if you have more facilities available, you have less problems with social distancing rather than shut down all the nurseries so everybody has to get their plants and flowers and soil from Lowe's. And the same thing for my next one, which is liquor stores. If you're going to, you can theoretically not sell liquor. That's not the policy I would recommend at this time. But you should have
nobody's meaner than forced sobriety on somebody.
Yeah,
so.
you should have the ability to buy your liquor at a small store, a chain store, whatever. Do it in a socially distant fashion, but having everybody have to go to a grocery store to pick up liquor and other alcoholic beverages doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense either. So just a few, any comments, any additional thoughts on those various things? That's kind of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Well, we're going to get to the firearms portion of our show, but the more recreational activities, shall we say.
Boy, you are right. And when these regulations, and what New Mexico's doing, they're not recreating the wheel. They're taking regulations that were done nationally in some of the other states, and they're copying those. And guess what? That's par for the course. That's how it works. To be otherwise would probably be not wise. But the big stores were able to take care of themselves because they're there defining what's essential and what isn't. And so to be defined as not essential, the liquor that I bought today for being a teetotaler, I must be an enabler because I was bought for the household here at a large box warehouse store. Couldn't have gone to a liquor store to get that. That was my choice. A grocery store there. Man, if you're the small business person that has the liquor store, I think you're just tearing your hair out. You're like, why? It's one of those I will do the social distance thing. Crazy. So, I don't know. It's very frustrating. And you know what? In an emergency and in a crisis, things are done that are not very nuanced. Guess what? This is not very nuanced. But if this thing's going to go on for a long time, and many people say we ought to act as if it will, meaning even if you're to quote unquote open the economy, there still will be some distancing, some things. It's time to start to do the nuance, or we're just going to needlessly kill businesses by the tens of thousands in our state, and the unemployment that will bring, and the slowdown in recovery when that starts to happen. We need to start taking a look at these things.
Yeah, and the gun stores are one of the final ones that I wanted to address. That's another one that's had a lawsuit. The New Mexico Shooting Sports Association has filed a lawsuit on that. The fact that the governor has not included gun stores among those that can be opened or should be open is, I think, more a illustration of her personal opinions than the reality when it comes to the gun stores. Not just because they are considered essential by so many people, especially in time of potential civic unrest, and that potential seems to grow closer every day. But also the way laws are now with regard to guns, gun stores are really an important component of the gun control mechanisms that have been put into place to process permits, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, restaurants. I know we talked to Carol White, or we have a podcast recently about COVID-19 and the restaurants, they should be able to deliver, sell liquor as part of their services as well. No need to get your delivery food from your favorite New Mexican restaurant or whatever it might be, and then have to go out separately to a grocery store to buy a bottle of scotch or whiskey or tequila, I guess would be the more
where you'll be exposed to people.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
the whole argument. It's
Right.
like, yeah, it's very inconsistent.
Yeah, and that's really what we're looking for here is if you're going to say people should maintain 6 feet of social distance, by and large, that is fine. We can be innovative. We can do things and overcome that for not just a short term, but intermediate term in terms, and the business owners can do that. It may not be ideal. It may not be as profitable, but it's certainly better than being completely shut down. And I just think we're missing the forest from the trees, or at least the governor is. And it's very, very frustrating for a lot of us, especially as golfers.
Well, and the whole thing was to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
Our curve is pretty flat here in New Mexico. We've done objectively speaking, I will say that if the goal was to flatten the curve has been flattened in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's time to take our victories and work a little bit policy-wise to make sure that we basically have a state to come back to when things open up.
No doubt about it. All right. Well, that was a long one, but it's an important one.
That was it, yes.
Because, the Rio Grande Foundation, we like to stick to clear, simple economic policy issues. But that kind of issue, the 8 things that should be reversed, is more nuanced. I mean, if your goal is exclusively to address COVID-19, then the only way to do that is for everybody to just shelter in place in their homes. I don't know, get food delivered to their porch, not interact with any employee delivering it. We can make a society where no disease can ever spread, but it'll be a miserable existence for each and every one of us. And then we can go back to complete normalcy, and undoubtedly a lot more people will get the virus, et cetera. What we're talking about, and it gets past the caricatures on both sides, is some kind of middle ground. And I don't think we've hit that sweet spot in terms of the middle ground in New Mexico. Our governor has done a pretty solid job in many respects with regard to the virus. We're waiting for a response to the economy, but we got to figure out a better way, I think, to fulfill social distancing as best as possible while also addressing real concerns about the economy, putting people back to work, giving them recreational opportunities, and ultimately also paying some taxes as a part of all that.
Well, one of the things that Mayor Cuomo is very good at is he definitely is talking about the virus and flattening the curve, stopping the spread. But he realizes he's over a huge state that has huge economic issues involved, and he talks about that. There's really been, unless I missed it, and believe me, I don't watch every briefing on that comes out of the state or even the federal. But we haven't even acknowledged that as an issue. That's something we need to look at, as far as I can tell.
Well, if you go to newmexico.org, you can find the governor's Economic Rapid Response Task Force and information there. But ultimately, it's not about a path forward for New Mexico or its businesses. It's about how do we address unemployment insurance benefits. And I mean, literally going and applying for them as a worker or former worker. How do you get hooked up with the Small Business Administration and their loan programs? How do you get LIDA zero interest loans? Can you get a personal income and payroll tax exemption, emergency paid sick leave, those kinds of things? Those are all worthwhile and it's very important stuff, but that's not long-term or even intermediate-term economic moving the state forward out of complete and total crisis mode. And we at the Rio Grande Foundation, of course, that is our bailiwick. We want to see policymakers looking at not just opening up the economy, but what are we going to do about the budget, about job creation, about some of these very critical issues that we haven't really seen discussed.
Yes, because if we look at round one of what Congress has done, a couple $1 trillion, but at the end of the day, $1,200 per person plus other loans, and on the one hand, $1 trillion, it's a fantastic amount. It's massive. It's incomprehensible how big it is. And yet you spread it over a large country like the United States, and it's not that big of a deal. The private economy, where people actually provide goods and services to each other and have employment as their primary method of livelihood, that's got to come more into the fore, I think, sooner instead of later. Or the real disaster of COVID-19 will be far greater at some point. The potential exists that the economic eventual consequences beat what even the virus did to us in the short term.
Yeah. So, of course, anytime you get talking about, or Wally and I at least, and anybody who knows gets talking about New Mexico's economy, oil and gas is sure to follow as a conversation point. And that has obviously been a serious concern for a lot of folks in the state of New Mexico. Budget folks, when they do have that discussion in the governor's office, she's going to be looking at oil and what impact that is going to have on the state budget. But President Trump, over the weekend, really was engaged in pretty intense, interesting negotiations. And if you are interested in the oil industry, there's no better person to follow than Daniel Yergin, Yergin. The book and miniseries, The Prize, is an incredible read and takes you all the way back to the very beginning of the oil and gas industry. And he wrote an article saying this was Trump's most complicated and momentous negotiation ever of his entire life. But the gist of it is that the world produces about 100 million barrels of oil a day, and the president was able to negotiate a 10% reduction in overall production. 2.5 million, so about half of the total, is going to be from the Saudis and the Russians, which is interesting because they're the ones that kind of precipitated this whole situation. I mean, at least on the oil side of things, on the supply side of things,
right?
There was going to be a massive decline in oil prices
because of demand, no matter what.
I saw a chart, earlier this week. It's dealing with gasoline consumption in the United States going back to like 1991, and it goes bouncing along generally on a slightly upward trajectory, and then just in the last few weeks, it just falls off the table. It's a phenomenal little chart to look at. But one of the interesting things is that he got buy-in from a number of countries. Mexico actually resisted cuts to production and was able to essentially keep their production moving. The United States, and the president doesn't really have the authority to tell American oil producers to stop producing, but he's pledged that the United States will also contribute to reducing oil and gas production, or oil production. I suspect that is more of a promise based on market forces that will ultimately prove to exist and to happen. But it is a fascinating deal. Again, it's probably for the best in the sense that they're about to fill up all the world's capacity in terms of storage.
Well, the storage is full, and then what do you do?
Yeah.
Oil may go negative, meaning
right. You can't have
you have to pay somebody to take your oil.
Yeah, kind of like interest rates in some respects. But the fact is that 10 million barrels isn't going to solve the problem long term. Again, this gets back to we have to start allowing people to get back to their day-to-day lives, because if you can't get in the car and drive somewhere, if you're not commuting to your job, if you can't hop on an airplane, if you can't get on a train, if freight won't be shipped, it's being shipped uh, by trucks and to an extent by trains, but I'm sure the freight overall is way, way down.
Right.
All of these things require or use oil and to an extent natural gas, but certainly oil. And until the consumption starts to pick back up, there's no way the prices can go up at all.
Yes, I look, and there's, the announcement of what Trump's negotiation, it bumped it up for a little bit. It came back down, and it is very, very low. And I'm with you. I believe that Trump is pretty confident with the current price and the current state of the market that the U.S. industry will contract that way. I certainly don't think he's going to have to put his thumb on the scale very hard to get the U.S.'s commitment, given that we're not like Saudi Arabia that has some of the lowest lifting costs in the world in terms of lowest cost to produce. We have shale. It takes, fracking. It takes work to do. And not that it's very expensive compared to what it used to be, but it's certainly not down there to where you're going to be doing a lot of development in $20 oil.
Median price is 40.
Yeah, 40,
40
50. Things happen pretty good. Above that, they happen real well. And below that, they slow down anyway, much less where we are right now with oversupply and really low oil price.
Yeah, and we have an effort underway, and a lawsuit again seems to be a theme. This one by the Republican Party of New Mexico against, I guess it's the Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, that would be towards, the idea that she has is to do mail-in voting for the June 2nd primary election. The primaries are a little different from a
because they're controlled by
election.
The parties, not
right. It's not. This is not necessarily mail-in election is not going to favor one party over the other. There's certainly an assumption made by Republicans, conservatives, whoever, that mail-in voting
in the general election would disadvantage
them.
them.
They think that. I'm not necessarily as convinced as others, and we can talk about that in a minute. But nearly all of the state's 33 county clerks, those are the folks who really carry out, they're the foot soldiers,
right.
At least generals maybe of the elections. They signed a petition calling for mail-in ballots. I presume that there will be some resolution to this before the primary takes off. There was a bit of a debacle up in Wisconsin regarding their primary election. There was a disagreement essentially between the governor, who wanted to shift the dates, and the courts that mandated that it happen.
Right.
I do think in terms of election integrity, there is a lot to be concerned about when it comes to mail-in elections. We saw it, the major election of all of our experiences when this happened was the APS tax increase election. Now that was so egregious, or maybe we were just so darn effective that we were able to convince everybody that 70+% of the voters that APS didn't need more money. But I had people calling me pretty constantly during that whole process saying, my cousin, mom, such and such, daughter, son, somebody's dead, somebody's moved out of state, they've been gone for 5, 8, 10 years, and yet they got a ballot. And the idea that this process has integrity to it, I do think there are real concerns about that, Wally.
Yeah, without a doubt. And then as long as the idiosyncrasies and the dirty dealing and all is spread evenly, then no one would have an advantage. But there's no reason to believe that. And when you're the party in power, I think it's incumbent upon you all the more. I mean, I would be saying this regardless. So if the Republicans were in charge, they would need in New Mexico, they would need to put in place a system that the Democrats thought was fair and equitable and protecting of their rights to vote. Well, they're not in charge in New Mexico. It's the Democrats, and it's incumbent upon them, if they're going to move that way, to not do it unilaterally, to do it such that there's confidence among those in the minority that this thing is at least fair. Because there's the whole idea that at times voter fraud is a huge issue or it's not a huge issue, but it is an issue. There's no doubt about that, and it's one of those issues that gets people's blood boiling. And when you're a democracy, the sanctity of the vote seems like an important thing that ought to be protected at a very high price to the electorate, to the state, to our country, because so much is at stake if people lose confidence.
Yeah, and I do think that part of the concern here is that the voter rolls have not been purged and maintained, and that you have so many people who shouldn't be receiving ballots who will receive ballots. Of course, in a
because nothing respects the memory of your departed relatives as voting their absentee ballot how they would have wanted to vote. And that's a joke, but there are these things, the points, the examples people have those all the time.
Well, the difference is, though, an absentee ballot you actually have to request.
So
but a mail-in ballot,
they just send it to you. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And so the quality of the voter rolls would be doubly important if they're just sending them out.
Yeah. Now, this is, I would call it a modest issue for this primary, because
modest in the primary, but potentially huge in the general.
Yeah,
would you
because
say that's
there's no ballot measures, there's no issues on this June primary that are not internal to the parties. You have Republicans running against Republicans, I should say, Democrats running against Democrats. Not sure if any libertarians are running against any libertarians, if they've stooped to the level of primarying each other, but
all 12 of them.
Yeah, but you do have that intra party dynamic, and there could be impacts there in terms of who ultimately wins based on the election techniques that are undertaken. One thing, Bernie Sanders, of course, just dropped out of the Democratic Party presidential election, and I do want your thoughts on this, Wally. Younger people are notorious for not being interested, not picking up mail, not going to that particular relatively outmoded, old-fashioned system.
I have contact with people who are 25 and below who question whether it should even exist. It's that, really, they're like, what do you mean you mailed me something? You mean like an Amazon box? No, like a letter. It's like, oh, no, don't, what is that?
And my point with that is, of course, the Democratic presidential election, candidate is Joe Biden, but Bernie Sanders was really the candidate of the younger 20-something set.
Right.
And I do think that a mail-in election would have worked contrary to Bernie's electoral hopes, for the simple reason that he's reliant on younger people, and younger people are just not so into mail-in. Perhaps, there's a long way to go between now and November. I hope, as I know you do, that we are not still in this state of suspended animation as a society by November. But I know the Democrats in general are counting on a lot of young voters turning out to support Joe Biden, and they generally get a higher percentage anyway. I think that is an underrated phenomenon working against folks who, on the left, also happen to be generally supporters of mail-in elections. So,
right.
We'll just see how it all shakes out here, but it's a fascinating question, and just one of many that have been put forth by this whole crisis, this whole situation. One last brief point to get to, and we've talked about it a little bit, but I think it's worth really going into a little bit of detail on our good friends, and I use that term advisedly. And Bill Jordan does listen to the podcast. At least he said so. He was out on Twitter saying that we can't go back to the austerity of the economic downturn, and we lost so much time and opportunity to improve our state's results thanks to the 2008-2009 economic crisis.
Now, does austerity mean government austerity
Yes.
or overall economic austerity?
I think he generally is referring to governments.
Okay.
And so he actually tweeted, I'll read it.
Okay.
New Mexico paid a steep price for the austerity of the Great Recession, and some in the New Mexico legislature are talking the same playbook, wanting to roll back some of the education and healthcare gains of the last year. If this crisis is teaching us anything, it's that building a stronger New Mexico, that's their tagline, is essential. This is from April the 6th. Now, you could talk, and there's no doubt that the Martinez years were more fiscally restrained, partially because Governor Susana Martinez was more of a fiscal conservative than the current
and partially because there wasn't
governor.
that
much money. And we're back to that latter place in time where we don't have much money. But I would look at early childhood initiatives, and you can go from fiscal 2011, where the state spent $10 million, to fiscal 2018, where we're spending on the order of $55 million. Of course, Governor Martinez accepted the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. There was a time of true austerity, I would say, 2008, 2009,
Yes.
when the world economy was in a true recession. Governor Martinez then, to the extent possible, without raising taxes, just allowed things to grow a little bit, and Medicaid grew through federal dollars. She had a priority of early childhood and that issue. The narrative that this time period was one of austerity is a narrative that I think is definitely open to question, but also the idea that we have an option at this point as we move out of this economic crisis. We don't have many choices. If voices and other groups are telling us we should raise taxes right now, that is the dumbest political move and policy move I can possibly imagine. If our governor were to do that, she would be committing, I believe, political suicide. It would be a disaster for her.
Yeah, and beyond the politics, I think from a policy standpoint, our old friend, the Laffer curve, I'm not sure it would work. I think it would be counterproductive. And so then we anger everyone who's here and scare away everyone who might think of coming here to open up, to have wide open spaces with more separation than you have in Midtown Manhattan or downtown Los Angeles. They're like, no, we're not going there. They're doing crazy stuff there.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be working on many issues relating to this that we'll probably unveil next week on the podcast or on errorsoфenchantment.com. So with that, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing the show.